So we just heard from Carl and Sabrina on AWS Tech, and I think you'll see how that works together with Trellix. So first of all, I'll introduce you to Trellix, and we'll go over some of the goals real quickly here, and then we'll get right into what the challenges are and how we create event timelines with XDR. All right, so before we get too far into it, my name is Martin Holste. I'm the CTO for Cloud at Trellix. I've been with the company through the Mandiant and FireEye acquisitions for the last 10 years and actually helped found the XDR product line 10 years ago with Mandiant. And before that, for 7 years, I ran a security operations center and incident response team in the public sector. That was a great way to get a ton of real world experience and understanding exactly what it's like to be out there on the front lines. And so that's really how I approach all of this. And I hope that is obvious as we go through it. And I also want you to meet Trellix. So Trellix is the new company between the merger of FireEye and McAfee Enterprise. And our values, which I love, are being tenacious, curious, and fun. I hope that comes across very clearly. And let's get right into it. All right, so what are the goals in overall fintech security? It's very similar to the goals in other industries, but with some extra tweaks here, right? So first of all, you're just trying to make sure that you're preventing, detecting, and remediating, right? So if there is an incident that occurs, remediating that and then being able to go back and try to prevent that. And we'll look at that loop in just a second. But there's also some of the things that we just heard about from AWS on managing risk and looking at overall compliance. All right, so here's this loop. So most people think about security starting from prevention, but as I mentioned, I ran a SOC, and from that standpoint, we had incidents all the time, as any SOC does. Any SOC that says they don't have incidents is not looking very hard. So we actually look at it from the remediation standpoint and then working backwards. So once you have actually remediated something, what have you done to prevent something like that in the future? And that's really a great way to see how well you're doing in your overall security program. And so from a fintech perspective, when we look at the prevention side, a lot of this can be around something like API security, and we'll dive into that in a little bit. I was talking to some friends in fintech, and they said that's the number one thing that they're concerned about right now is that API security and making sure that as you have all these financial transactions occurring, that they're generally happening over APIs, and that means that there's a lot of things that go with that. So putting protections out in front of APIs is a big deal. But what happens after that point in your day-to-day operations? Are you able to detect what happens there? And hopefully you'll see that's really where the XDR part comes in. So when we talk about risk management in general, there's two components that goes into that. And this is the stuff you know ahead of time. So this is the vulnerability management, so software vulnerabilities. The administrative and customer phishing susceptibility is a big part of this. So for fintech, that's both on running, making sure that your administrators are not vulnerable to phishing, but also your customers, right? You have to worry about if they are being phished and if they are having fraud occur to them. And then, of course, the supply chain service area. We heard all about this over the last few years, things like the SolarWinds attack, in which you had software libraries that were malicious that were introduced into an overall application, and that made the application itself compromised. And then you also have the threat intel side. So just understanding who's out to get you, right? So that the threat actors themselves and their profiles, whatever behavioral indicators you have right now to try to figure out who that might be right now. And then what are the threats to customers? So things like crimeware gangs. So all this goes into that risk. And then that dictates what policies you want to set, how strict you need to be there for your user app and host configurations. And as we just heard from AWS on the compliance side, it's a big part of this. And that basically means that the other part of this is having to prove that you've done all of this. So can you prove that the actions are logged, that hosts are well configured, systems can be recovered? So we saw how easy that can be on the Amazon side, but there's a lot of other aspects to this. And at the end, you also have the specific regulations like PCI, SOX, and HIPAA, of course. And so this can depend on a lot of different ways to show this. You can demonstrate that your SIEM and XDR are configured well. You can provide host configs, provide access to directories, disaster recovery plans, and of course, code audits when necessary. All right, so let's dig right into some of the problems. What are some of the common pitfalls when you're actually trying to do this? So these are pretty high level, but I think they're very relevant. So you have a diversity of security tools all over the place. You have evolving threats. So, I talked about SolarWinds a few years ago. Now we have threats on AI and things like that are coming out now. So every day is a different day in security. Shortage of staff that's always a problem. You never have enough staff. It doesn't really matter where you're at. That's consistent. You have complicated environments, so understanding the different aspects between those, especially for larger shops. You're going to have many different stakeholders within your organization. And then, of course, the investigation complexity itself, and we'll talk about exactly what goes into that. So we talked about threats and how these come together with the environment complexity. And that's why you ended up with a lot of different tools, because you had a lot of different jobs to do. So that's just the organic nature of it, right? Because you had this evolution of threats and the environment complexity, you needed a lot of different tools. Okay, and then you add in the fact that you have a shortage of staff, and suddenly everything becomes very complicated because you have a lot of different jobs to do and not enough people to do them. And that's how we got here. All right, so as an example, I talked about API security being so important. So let's say that your organization is setting up a new relationship with another financial organization. So you have to set up ways to do financial transactions over an API. So this is just a very short list of all the many things that your security staff need to be responsible for now. There's API keys that have to be properly shared and managed. You have to figure out the flow of the data through that API, and you have to track it, audit it, and secure it. And now you need to understand the risk to that partner. So if that partner is compromised, what does that mean to the transactions that are flowing through that API? And when an incident does occur, how are you going to enumerate, locate, and access all this different data that you're going to need at that time? So doing fire drills early and often. All right, so where does XDR come into this? First of all, what is XDR? It's extended detection and response. Detection and response, okay, those things are obvious, but what does it mean to be extended? And so that means we are providing additional access and understanding with more data that's coming in, more different types of data. I like to call it defense in breadth versus defense in depth. So what does this mean on a timeline perspective? So if you have all this stuff coming through, you have to first establish a timeline of activities if you're trying to figure out what happened. And in this case, maybe it's who transferred how much and from what account. If you're going all the way down to the business level and trying to trace back through a specific incident, okay, what happened? What about that asset that's affected? Does this system have the rights to be using this bank account? These are the kinds of questions that security staff get asked, but they're not experts in perhaps that financial transaction system. But on that day, they need to become experts in that system. So what does that process look like? How do they get from point A to point B and become experts for a day? And what the bare minimum that they need to know in order to understand if something was in fact authorized. And then there's that situational awareness. So as I said, what are the threats that are currently out there? So expecting what type of actor is going after you. What would it look like if they were active in the environment? So we call these threat models, as in, if that were occurring, what would we expect to see? And are we currently seeing it? And then given these threats, how vulnerable are my assets and my customers? So those threats, again, for financial systems, they may be going after the end customers and trying to get in that way, but you may be holding the assets that they're after. So here's an AWS example with guard duty. So you get an alert like this fairly frequently with any significant AWS account. And the tricky thing with these they are either absolutely nothing to worry about, or the sky is falling very, very bad. And the problem is, from a security staff perspective, how do you figure out which one it is? Can we move on with their day and go to the next alert? Or do we have a huge incident that everyone needs to be all hands on deck? So you have to ask a lot of questions about every single alert like this. Like, when was this particular domain declared malicious? We got a hit that said it was malicious. Okay, well, when was it malicious? Maybe it's not malicious anymore. Maybe it's been recycled, all that kind of thing. What about the IP address that's being referred to? It's a 10 dot. Okay, well, that means it's a local IP address. We don't know anything about that asset when we start out. How easy it is for your security staff to get that kind of information? And what did this overall communication look like? Was it just the DNS request? Were there any additional bits of traffic after that, where maybe they were setting up an HTTPS connection, like a callback? Were there specific pings or things like that? And all this takes a lot of data to sort out. You can see there's tons of questions and not very many answers. So answers come in the form of all these different inputs. And so here's we call it a NASCAR slide, because there's so many different logos. But we have about 120 different integrations for our XDR, where we pull in specifically from all these different vendors. And we'll walk through the high level real quickly. We also bring in data from over 1,000 other different event sources that we normalize and parse. But these are the ones that we go out and specifically get the information for or directly integrate with. So we start with identity. Big deal, obviously. So just things like Active Directory, but also things like two-factor. So looking at what permissions they had, where they were when they authenticated. So did they use two-factor? Yes or no? That could be a huge red flag if you have an incident and you find out that the login was a single factor, and that's not part of policy. That means that somebody got in, disabled the two-factor on it, and then were able to use a stolen password to do something. So having access to all that information becomes really critical to figuring this out. And then there's the business app side. So being able to correlate all of this with the events themselves. So this is Office data, might be Salesforce data, even be things like TeamViewer, being able to see who logged into a server, screen share wise, or even things like Teams and Slack, where there are specific messages or files shared that way. Speaking of files, cloud storage is a big part of this. Were there malicious things that came through? We've seen many cases where there's a company that's been acquired and there's a giant pile of data there in cloud storage. And sure enough, some of them were malicious, but the acquiring entity had no idea. So we have a lot of ways to look at malicious files that are in cloud storage, but just being able to trace where a file came from is really important whenever an investigation is occurring. And a lot of that comes down to that bulk telemetry that you're getting, saying, yep, this file was accessed by this person at this time. And so you can start to build these timelines. And of course, email, still business email compromise, any kind of email is often still the first way in to at least get credentials. And we'll walk through exactly what that looks like here in a minute. But getting that low level access to email is a big deal. And I see, just as a side note here, Microsoft is now going to open up some of their really detailed Exchange tracking logs finally to most customers, which is a big deal. We've been wanting that for a really long time on in XDR land, because without those, it's very difficult to track where a specific incident originated. So glad to see that we'll get a lot more telemetry from O365 in the near future. Endpoint, big deal, of course. Many investigations are rooted on this, and we're going to look at exactly what that looks like. But we take pretty much events from anybody and everybody. It's all important. And many companies run multiple different endpoints, between the different business units. But the main one I want to talk about today for financial services is the fraud prevention side. In particular, we have a really interesting integration with Bottomline that I want to dive into. This is actually going to show every single transaction that happens on a mainframe. And we'll look at exactly what that looks like. But here's why it's so important. So let's say you get an email that comes through, and then you're able to trace through, where they authenticated, who they were, and then the attacker is able to create a service account from there, propagate onto other endpoints, passing through things like DLP and the network until they eventually are able to log into the mainframe. And so this whole trail of events is really unclear if you have these silos where you look at vertically, well, here's all the email logs. Okay, all we know is that there was an email received. All the MFA logs, all the directory logs, they just have one view of it, but the actual timeline passes through all of them. And so on the mainframe, this becomes really important when you see this. So this is a mainframe screen, and with our integration with Bottomline, we're able to do something really cool where we can pull out the actual data that's passing through as JSON into our XDR. So Bottomline does the hard work of reading the network capture and then creating that JSON, and through our integration, we're able to codify exactly what's happening here. So this is what it looks like in XDR. You can see the actual transactions that are occurring on the mainframe down to who's doing what was the dollar amount, what was the account number it was coming from, all the way through. We have cool dashboards that you can build with this. It's really just data that you can do anything with and tie it together with everything else to make threat graphs like this. So you can see these were the attackers, here's where they came from, and at the end of the day, here's what they transferred. So here, let's look at the timeline themselves and see why this is so important to be able to put it together. So without XDR, you just have a pile of logs. So you have email transaction logs, you have identity logs, directory, the mainframe that we just showed, which is interesting, but not the whole story, and of course, antivirus logs. So when we first come across an antivirus alert, we don't know all this stuff until we can put it together. But the story goes that user X logged in after receiving a link from an email, and that user created a service account, which is very unusual. That user then transferred $100,000, which is very unusual. And then we get an antivirus hit on the endpoint. So you may be realizing that the antivirus hit came after, right? And so the risk actually from the outset looks like this. You have a 20% risk at the beginning. Okay, it gets riskier when you see the service account created. The dollar amount transferred was quite risky, but then you know it's 100% risk when you have something that's declared malicious by antivirus. And the problem here is that the antivirus alert, which is the top hit that we had because it was the thing that we knew was malicious because it was just a standard AV hit, was actually the least interesting part of this whole thing. It's the tip of the iceberg here. It's below the surface. We had a rogue mainframe transaction. We had a compromised user account. And the worst thing of all, you're being actively targeted by a crimeware gang trying to get in the first place. And all this, and if you don't look beneath the surface, you just know about the antivirus alert. So now that you know all the rest of it, you realize that you are at 100% risk the entire time. From when it was 100% risk for that email because it was malicious, it was 100% risk during the lateral movement to creating the service account, and onward through the malicious transfer of money. So this gives us the ability to understand assets a lot better, and we can do a lot better than anything on its own. So by adding up the risk, we can actually get to something closer to 100% as we see these events come through the entire timeline versus just waiting until we get hopefully an antivirus hit that actually triggers the investigation essentially after everything has happened. So that's why it's so important to have all these other different systems to map it out. All right, so that leads us to the remediation, which is the hardest and most important part of this. And so very few places are able to actually take actions based on these detections because the complexity gets really hard. The actions are generally manual, and it can put the business and customers at risk if you automatically take actions. So in general, we don't see that a lot of the hatches are battened down, so to speak. It's hard after an incident to go back and start to really, apply those new policies that are needed, or to rectify some of the initial things, because especially if you're trying to do it in an automated fashion, there's a chance you might break something. So most customers aren't able to do that. But it's a lot easier if you have XDR because you're going to get the full context, so you know exactly what happened and you know exactly the right place in that entire timeline to apply that protection. And you need, it leaves very few places where you actually need the manual intervention. So you might still do it manually, but oh, we just needed to do this at this point in time, and it would have prevented the entire chain of events. And that's really what you're going for. All right, so how do we measure this? I'll just leave you with a couple of interesting metrics here. So these are just general ones, and you can make up ones that make sense for your own organization. But for instance, given an asset, how many different data sources do we have connected to that? So especially things like mainframe, you might only have one source of information, but even adding network telemetry, if you think back to that screenshot I had, it had IP addresses in there. You can chain those IP addresses with a lot of other things. So do you have the network telemetry that goes to the mainframe that also has those transactional logs? That would mean you go from 1 to 2, right? So that's a good way to track how well are we protecting these things, as saying how many different data sources do we have connected? And then what percentage of those data sources can be linked together? So do the field names line up? It's one thing to just have those silos of data, but you can't match them up if the field names don't match. That's a big part of this. And how far can we trace an action? So you saw that whole timeline. Are you able to chain all those different things together? That's a good thing to measure and be able to show to management that, yes, we are making progress on this. And what percentage of financial transactions are secured through XDR? So if you say, okay, well, we've got, our O365 or G Suite, we've got our business stuff over here, but then we got the mainframe and all the other API stuff coming through, that's totally separate because some other team runs that. Well, those aren't really being protected. They have their own controls on them, sure, but you don't really know what's happening like you would any of the other steps. And so that's a big part of this. So one of the key things that we look at in the industry is the mean time to detect. So if a credential is stolen, how long did it take you to find out that that particular credential was stolen? And adding on to that, this is probably the best metric you can have, which is the mean time to respond. So adding on to the mean time to detection, okay, we were able to figure out that the credential was stolen, and there's the moment of alert, so that's MTTD. But how long did it take you to disable that credential? Because that measures essentially the length of your breach. All right, so with that, do we have any questions?